Welcome to the October edition of This Month in Payroll. I'm Rohan Geddes, the Australian lead for PwC's payroll consulting practice, and thank you for tuning in again to hear the latest in payroll news. There are two key themes that we want to focus on this month. First, ATO audits and penalties, and secondly, insights gathered from the Fair Work reporting season. We'll also provide an update on the SG Amnesty and on some 1 November 2018 changes around Victorian Long Service Leave and penalty rates for retailers. PwC's payroll consulting practice takes a balanced approach to advising clients on risk. We avoid using scaremongering to generate consulting revenue. Therefore, when I lead this month's update talking about audits and penalties, I do so hesitantly. However, there's a trend developing which is noteworthy. We are hearing of an increase in incidents of significant audits and sizable penalties in the employment taxes and payroll space. Worryingly, they seem to be happening to employers with otherwise good compliance records. They are occurring in two key areas: employment obligation audits and significant global entity penalties. A few years ago, we saw a rise in employment obligation audits being issued by the tax office. These audits generally arose because the ATO found that the PAYG remittances were less than the PAYG reported. Often, the mismatch was explainable. The remittance had been incorrectly attributed to a wrong member of the group, or there was a timing issue at the end of the financial year, resulting in the PAYG remittance being received after, often just by a matter of a few days, the financial year in which it was reported. However, from that simple, explainable error, employers found they were stuck in the middle of a comprehensive employment obligation audit that required them to reconcile all employment tax remittances, including PAYG, SG, FBT and workers' comp, for the last 4 years, occasionally across the entire group. And, having raised the audit, it was difficult, but not impossible, for the tax office to shut it down. Fortunately, the employer obligation audits dropped off after a year or so. Until now. In the last 3 months, we have seen a rise in these audits, similar causal reasons, similar comprehensive level of review. Advising employers on how to prevent the audits is difficult. Ensure your remittances are correctly allocated to the right employer within your group. Make sure your remittances match your reporting. That's what we do all the time, right? However, if you do get an audit, I recommend that you engage with your tax advisor and seek a meeting with the tax office investigating officer immediately to understand the cause of the audit and to see if the offending error can be explained. We have had some success in limiting the scope of the audit once we've been able to explain the error. The second trend we are seeing is more perplexing, costly and ominous. The significant global entity penalty regime was introduced effective 1 July 2017, applying to businesses whose global group revenue exceeds $1 billion. The SGE regime doubles administrative penalties and increases failure to lodge penalties by 500 times, meaning that lodging a taxation document up to 28 days late can incur a $105,000 penalty, which could increase to $525,000 if the tax document is lodged more than 112 days late. Scary numbers. Payroll-related forms that this regime applies to include tax file number declarations and PAYG withholding summary annual reports. This includes PAYG payment summaries, foreign employment forms, employer termination payments, and also annual reports for ABNs not quoted, payments to foreign residents, and the departing Australian superannuation payments. Given the number of forms that payroll is responsible for lodging, the risk that this regime generates for payroll is enormous. The ATO has previously been clear that it will maintain its existing approach to the imposition and remission of failure to lodge penalties. For example, an SGE penalty will not be automatically imposed for late lodgement of a statement, and remission can still be applied for where there are extenuating circumstances, natural disasters, serious illness, provided the employer has a good compliance record. However, we've become aware of a number of instances recently in which employers have been hit with these exceptionally high SGE penalties for late lodgements of a tax form. Recent examples include an employer who received two $210,000 SGE penalties for late lodgement of instalment activity statements. The penalty was raised after the statements had been lodged by the taxpayer, rather than as a result of the audit, and the amount of tax on the statements was significantly less. Another employer received a $200,000 penalty for late lodgement of a BAS, and a third employer received a $105,000 penalty for lodging the FBT return 1 month late. It appears that there was no advance warning that the penalty may be issued, and the penalties have been imposed despite the employers having a good compliance record. Given the large number of potential lodgements this regime applies to, taxpayers need to take the risk of liabilities arising very seriously. And I point out that neither the employment obligation audits nor the SGE penalties are linked to STP. Some of the employers referenced here have not even transitioned onto STP yet. What it represents is a shift in the regulatory environment. And while it's not the intention of STP, that could make things worse, as more data becomes available to the tax office more often, highlighting more quickly filing discrepancies. All of this reminds us that there is an ongoing need for employers to be diligent about their filing and remittances, reviewing system setups, processes, and vendor commitments. We've been monitoring the progress of the proposed Superannuation Guarantee Amnesty. Unfortunately, our last few months have basically been there is no update. That changes slightly this month. While the legislation is still yet to be enacted, the ATO has provided an update to employers explaining how the amnesty will work. If you've missed an SG payment, or if you haven't paid an employee super on time, you need to lodge an SG charge statement and pay the amount owing. The ATO will apply the current law to this statement, meaning that the administration component of $20 per employee must be paid, interest of 10% must be paid, the payment must be made to the tax office rather than directly to the employee's SG account, the SG catch-up payments will be treated as non-deductible, and the employer may be liable to further penalties by the tax office. If the proposed SG amnesty is enacted, the ATO will then apply the benefits retrospectively to any voluntary disclosure made between 24th of May 2018 and 23rd of May 2019. The benefits are that the administration component and any penalties applied but not the interest will be refunded, and the employer will be able to treat the SG catch-up payment as tax deductible. It's important to note that the amnesty will not apply if an employer is subject to an SG audit for any of the periods covered by the voluntary disclosure. This includes the employer obligation audits mentioned earlier, and the amnesty will only cover periods up to 1 April 2018. And the ATO has flagged again that employers who do not disclose the SG shortfalls during the amnesty period may face harsher penalties if they are audited in the future. The continued uncertainty as to whether the proposed SG amnesty will be passed is, unfortunately, placing employers in a difficult position as to the extent to which they actively go looking for SG underpayments in a bid to ensure that they are not inadvertently non-compliant. And while on the topic of proactively looking for potential SG errors, one that we want to draw people's attention to is SG on leave loading. Leave loading is not considered ordinary time earnings if the employer is able to show that the purpose of making a leave loading payment is to compensate for the loss of opportunity to work overtime. This purpose would be gathered from the underlying instrument driving the payment, the award or the enterprise agreement. However, if the award or the EA is not clear, there is a heightened risk that the tax office will interpret the payments as being OTE. When we have done code reviews to help employers get STP ready, we have found that many employers have simply assumed that leave loading is not subject to SG, without reference to the underlying instrument. Given the current audit environment and the SG focus, we believe that this is an area worth reviewing by all employers who are currently making leave loading payments. It's reporting season at Fair Work, with the Fair Work Commission and the Fair Work Ombudsman releasing their annual reports. There are some interesting statistics in there, which give a sense of the authority's focus for the last year and next year. Let's start with the Fair Work Commission, whose annual report provided insight into the volume of enterprise agreements reviewed and approved each year. In 2017-18, the Fair Work Commission reviewed over 4,600 agreements, approving 82% of them. 17% were withdrawn and 1%, 42, were refused. Interestingly, of the applications that were approved, 68% were approved with an undertaking. This has increased from 41% last year and 30% 3 years ago, reflecting a significant trend. This trend is also reflected in the time taken to deal with applications for approval of agreements. The median time to finalise all agreement approvals last year was 76 days, an increase on the 32 days from last year and 18 from the year before. From the Fair Work Ombudsman's report, we get a good sense of compliance activity and focus. Last year, the Fair Work info line answered more than 375,000 calls, and the anonymous report tool received over 15,000 anonymous reports, which was an increase of 44% from the previous year. Hospitality was by far the most reported industry, amounting to 37% of all reports. The next highest industries were retail and building and construction. The Fair Work Ombudsman proactively audited over 4,500 workplaces in 2017-18, targeting specific industries, regions and businesses across Australia. Of these, 630 audits targeted larger businesses. 36% of these businesses audited were found to be non-compliant, with top contraventions relating to hourly rate underpayments, failure to provide payslips in the prescribed form, and penalty rates for weekend work. In 2017-18, the Ombudsman initiated 35 litigations and achieved over $7.2 million in court-ordered penalties, $5.8 million against companies and $1.4 million against individuals. This is the highest amount of penalties they've ever secured in a financial year, and the trend is not slowing. As at 30 June 2018, the Fair Work Ombudsman had 85 more matters before the courts. Migrant workers accounted for 20% of all formal disputes and generated some of the highest penalties that the Fair Work Ombudsman has ever secured, including a record $660,000 for an employer in the fruit industry and a $500,000 penalty against a contract cleaning company. Finally, the annual report indicates that next year, the Fair Work Ombudsman will concentrate on the fast food, restaurant and cafe subsectors of the hospitality industry. The clear message from these two annual reports is that we are operating in an increasingly more complex industrial environment with an ever more aggressive regulator. Some updates as of 1 November 2018. First of all, if you are an employer in Victoria, you should be aware that the new long service leave rules have now come into place, affecting the periods during which long service leave accrues, when long service leave can be taken, and how long service leave is calculated where an employee's hours of work change. Specifically, long service leave now accrues during all paid parental leave and during the first 52 weeks of unpaid parental leave. An employee is now entitled to take 104 weeks of parental leave, up from 52 weeks, before creating a break in service. Employees are now able to take long service leave after 7 years of continuous employment, down from 10 years, and are able to take long service leave 1 day at a time, rather than over a maximum of 3 periods. Finally, where an employee's hours of work change during their employment, long service leave is now calculated at the highest average of either the previous 12 months, 5 years, or new, the entire period of employment. Also on 1 November 2018, penalty rates for retailers will be adjusted to give effect to the Fair Work Commission's review of the General Retail Industry Award. The Commissioner considered the application of penalty rates for work undertaken by casuals on evenings, Saturdays and Sundays. For evening work, hours worked after 6 p.m. on a weekday, the Commissioner found that casuals were entitled to an additional penalty rate on top of the casual loading, commencing at 5% in November and increasing to 25% by March 2021. For hours worked by a casual on a Saturday, the Commissioner ordered that an additional 15% should be paid from November 2018, rising to 25% by March 2020. However, Sunday penalty rates for full-time and part-time employees have been reduced from 200% down to 195% in November and phasing down to 175% by July 2020. The reduction is mirrored for casual employees, whose penalty rates have been dropped to 220% in November 2018, phasing down to 200% by July 2020. No STP update this month, apart from a continuation of the message that employers who have transitioned across to STP have found it to be a relatively smooth transition. However, we do promise to offer more information next month because at our next Payroll Managers Forum, held on Wednesday the 21st of November across the country, we're delighted to announce that our guest speaker will be John Shepherd, the ATO lead for Single Touch Payroll. John will be presenting from our Canberra office and video conferencing live across the country. We're keen to hear about the insights the Tax Office has gained from the STP rollout so far and what recommendations he has as we move closer to all employers reporting real time. If you're not already on our mailing list to receive invitations to our events, I suggest you either subscribe now via our website, pwc.com.au/payroll, or send me an email and I'll ensure you're added to our database. I'll have new payroll updates next month, but in the meantime, if you have any payroll questions, you can find information on our website or email me at rohan.geddes@pwc.com or message me via LinkedIn. In the meantime, have a great month.